So, outside some of the main world news stories that are going on right now, such as the situation in northern Iraq and the Ukraine crisis, I haven't had a lot of time to follow the protests in Hong Kong, but in the last few days I have been following it a little bit more. And it's caught my attention that now the Chinese side is complaining about a British select committee looking into this, looking into supporting the protesters. The Chinese have responded angrily and accused us of interfering. If you're not from China or the UK or Hong Kong, just to give you a little bit of background, for a long time, up until 1997, Hong Kong was a British overseas territory, and it was under British jurisdiction. Now, in 1984, the British and Chinese governments signed a joint declaration. It's known as the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and it was under Prime Ministers Margaret Thatcher and Zhao Ziyang. And that was a mutual agreement on the eventual handover of Hong Kong. I'm not going to go into all the formal details with this because it's simply too comprehensive for a YouTube video. I will put a link to the Wikipedia page. I cannot find the direct article itself, but basically there's been very big protests in Hong Kong this year, with increasing anxiety about the role the Chinese Communist Party is going to play in the territory. Now, ever since Hong Kong handed over in 1997, incidentally, I bought a book about this, a discount book the other day, by Chris Patton, who, as you can see, I still haven't removed the price. It's a discount book, I only got it a few days ago. Chris Patton was the last British governor of Hong Kong, and I think this will be a very interesting book. There's one bit at the end where he sort of, it's quite a interesting picture actually, shows him greeting locals as he departs. I think you can, sorry, that's, and he's sort of mockingly says there, the colonial oppressor oppressing again, because of course that's long been the jargon of the Chinese Communist Party about European powers, and it was sort of their mantra for taking Hong Kong back. Now, let me just be clear about something. This video is not any sort of call for British colonialism or taking Hong Kong back or anything like that. However, I do feel that China has betrayed its side of the joint declaration. Now, with the joint declaration, the agreement was that Hong Kong would go back to China. It's known in this country as the handover. I'm not sure what it's known as in China, but it's known as the handover. So, Hong Kong and Macau today are part of the People's Republic of China, but they are special administrative territories. Special administrative regions is the full name, SARs. And with that comes a strong degree of autonomy. Now, I'm just going to read out some of the clauses of the joint declaration. Bear with me. Okay, this was the joint declaration clauses. National unity and territorial integrity shall be upheld, and a Hong Kong Special Administrative Region shall be established. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will be directly under the authority of the Central People's Government of the PRC and will enjoy a high degree of autonomy, except in foreign and defence affairs. It will be vested with executive, legislative and independent judicial power, including that of final adjudication, and the laws currently in force in Hong Kong will remain basically unchanged. The government of the HKSAR will be composed of local inhabitants, but the chief executive will be appointed by the Central People's Government, and he will nominate the principal officials. Furthermore, the legislature of the HKSAR shall be constituted by elections. Not just the current social and economic system in Hong Kong will remain unchanged, also the lifestyle and rights and freedoms, including those of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly, of association, of travel, of movement, of correspondence, of strike, of demonstration of choice of occupation, of academic research and of religious belief, inviolability of the home, the freedom to marry, the right to raise a family freely. Those will be ensured by law, as well as the private property ownership of enterprise, legitimate right of inheritance and foreign investment. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will retain the status of a free port and separate customs territory. It can continue the free trade policy, including free movement of goods and capital. The HKSAR will retain the status of an international financial centre with free flow of capital and Hong Kong dollar remaining freely convertible. The HKSAR may authorise designated banks to issue or continue to issue Hong Kong currency under statutory authority. It will have independent finances with its own budgets and final accounts, but reporting to the Central People's Government. Additionally, the Central People's Government will not levy taxes on it. The HKSAR may establish mutually beneficial economic relations with the United Kingdom and other countries. The name used for international relations will be Hong Kong, China. In doing so, it may maintain and develop economic and cultural relations and agreements with states, regions and relevant international organisations on its own, and it may issue travel documents for Hong Kong. International agreements to which the PRC is not a party, but Hong Kong is, may remain implemented in the HKSAR. The government of the HKSAR is responsible for the maintenance of public order. Military forces sent in by the Central People's Government stationed in the HKSAR for the purpose of defence shall not interfere in the internal affairs of the HKSAR. Those basic policies will be stipulated in the Basic Law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region in the PRC by the National People's Congress and remain unchanged for 50 years. Okay, I want to digest that a little bit and break some of it down. I'm not going to go point by point because I simply don't have time in this video. But 50 years, so that was agreed in 1984, 30 years ago. The handover itself was June 1997, which is 17 years ago. Now, it's pretty obvious that in recent years, the Chinese Communist Party has been trying its level best to exert more and more power within Hong Kong. They'd done this a few years ago with the attempt to force their curriculum onto Hong Kong, which was promptly angrily rebuked by people in Hong Kong, because they saw it as being part of the mainland system, which is arguably just brainwashing, or if that seems like too strong a term, at the very least propaganda. And I know what it's like, I've seen it myself. It goes along the lines of Chairman Mao was a great man who was loved by all the Chinese people, and that's the sort of rhetoric they use. It's not very objective, and it basically whitewashes Chinese history and makes out the Chinese Communist Party to be almost faultless, or if whatever faults they have had, it was mistakes rather than moral wrongs. So I could understand the controversy around that. Finally that got defeated. Hong Kong today is not a democracy, not in the sense of as we would see it in Western countries, but certainly enjoys more freedom of expression and so on than the mainland PRC. So in that sense, the Chinese have upheld that. However, it's pretty obvious that the Communist Party is trying their level best to exert their power in the territory. They have stooges like Jackie Chan, who sort of promote their propaganda, but there is a lot of Hong Kong people, I know several of them online, who deeply resent what the CPC are trying to do in Hong Kong. And now, with them saying to these British MPs to mind their own business, it's basically typical of the CCP attitude. Now, there's absolutely no British desire to take Hong Kong back. For one thing, we couldn't afford it, and it's not going to happen. So I really don't think the Chinese Communist Party needs to worry about that. However, they're not fully obliging their side of the agreement. There's one bit of that particularly caught my attention, and that is the lifestyle and rights and freedoms, including those of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly. That particular segment is very significant because several of those things have already been violated by the Chinese Communist Party. For example, freedom of the press. Already there's been issues in Hong Kong with the Chinese Communist Party trying to interfere in press autonomy in the territory. Now, it has to be said, Journalists enjoy a lot more freedom in Hong Kong than they do in the mainland, but these protests are understandable, and how the Chinese Communist Party responds is going to be very significant. So far, thankfully, there's been no serious violence, but there has been significant unrest, in the sense that there's been a lot of arrests. Some of it's been quite tense. There has been scenes of people being forced onto the ground by police officers. And if the CCP goes down a line of hardline authoritarianism, and if they dare do what they done in 1989, I think it will be much worse than it was then, and the international response will be much worse. So I really think they should be very careful about how they respond to this. Hong Kong is not going to go back to the United Kingdom anytime soon. Probably never. So they don't have to worry about that. But what they should be focusing on is their response. And if they're too hardline, the people of Hong Kong, the bulk of them, are not going to accept it. I should say there are some Hong Kongers who are pro-CCP, although I'm very sceptical, I have to say. I would not be surprised if the Chinese Communist Party has paid them to do it, and is basically getting recruits. I wouldn't even be surprised if they're mainlanders who've been drafted in, because it's very hard to imagine that there's many Hong Kongers who want less autonomy than they currently have. That is just nonsensical. If you ask a Hong Kong person, do you want more autonomy, or do you want a situation where the CCP has absolute power in the territory, I think most Hong Kong people would go for the former. It's not a case of wanting to be part of the UK again, wanting to be, well, not that they ever were, but they don't want to be a British territory. What they do want is autonomy. I should say there is a group on Facebook calling for Hong Kong to be part of Britain again. It's been signed by a few thousand people. But the clear indication here is that many people in Hong Kong are deeply uneasy about what the Communist Party agenda really is in the territory. Is it really about maintaining Chinese control of Hong Kong as part of the People's Republic of China, with devolution, with autonomy? Or is it about trying to subtly, over time, exert more and more influence? I mean, this education proposal that they put forward, that was blatantly an attempt to try and brainwash a young generation of Hong Kong people into the mainland sort of curriculum, which was clearly ridiculous, and they clearly weren't going to accept it. And I'm pleased it backfired. Not because I want to get one over on the Chinese or anything like that, because I'm British, and you know, if you're Chinese you might be thinking, oh, you Brits are trying to get Hong Kong back. It's really not about that. It's about respecting the Sino-British joint declaration. This wasn't a Sino declaration, it wasn't just the Chinese side, it was a joint declaration, which means that China has to respect its obligations as well. And whilst for the most part it has, it is pretty clear that in recent years the CCP has been trying to exert far more influence than that joint declaration insinuated. And I do think there's legitimate concerns in Hong Kong. So from that point of view, I fully respect the protesters. I hope it doesn't get worse. I hope there isn't any violence. And for the record, I have no desire to see China broken up. I have no issue with Hong Kong being part of China, but I do have issue with the CCP using its force in China. That is something that is intolerable, and I think if they respond with heavy force, and God forbid if there's any deaths, I don't think there will be, but if we do see a repeat of 1989, if things get out of hand and it ends up like that, the international community will not forgive it. Will not forgive the CCP this time. They're already trying to whitewash history. They've been trying it for 25 years, and that is utterly shameful. But if they try that in Hong Kong, and I'm someone who has Chinese friends. I am absolutely not anti-Chinese, but I do have a big problem with the Communist Party's authoritarianism and their utter disregard for civil liberty. I do take issue with that. I take issue with it anywhere in the world where that is an issue. I take issue with it. So the situation is quite tense, and if I were the CCP, I would back off, and I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating violent protest, but the people of Hong Kong do have a right to be angry, because they can see what's happening. They can see that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to impose their will on the people of Hong Kong, which is a violation of Hong Kong's autonomy. They're talking about British MPs minding their own business, although incidentally I should point out, these select committees are to investigate the role of Britain's responsibility. It isn't to interfere with the Chinese role, it's more to do with examining what our role is. And by the way, these committees are happening in the UK, so if anyone's interfering, it's the Chinese. But that, in my opinion, is an excuse that they always use when they don't want the outside world scrutinising their authoritarianism. And that is what we are seeing increasingly in Hong Kong. So in conclusion, I'm not suggesting China lose Hong Kong, not for a second. Hong Kong is part of China, I accept that. But the CCP has to respect the autonomy of Hong Kong, otherwise they are violating the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which guaranteed autonomy to the people of Hong Kong. And with that, it was a guarantee of civil liberties in Hong Kong. Now, if they want to impose their single-party rule in the territory, they are violating that agreement. And that is what they are trying to do. So it is right that it is scrutinised. And of course Britain is right to be concerned about this, because it was a joint declaration with this country. This wasn't an internal affair, this was a joint declaration with the United Kingdom. Okay, so leave it there, but in short, I support the protesters. So long as they're peaceful, I support them.